Listen to this revelation with complete focus. Arthur Schopenhauer discovered something that strikes at the very heart of human social psychology. Intelligence intimidates the masses, not because they cannot understand it, but because they understand exactly what it represents, the possibility that they could think differently if they chose to, and the uncomfortable recognition that they have chosen not to. If you have ever wondered why your intellectual capabilities seem to generate fear rather than respect, why groups of people become defensive and hostile when confronted with superior reasoning, why the masses consistently reject the very intelligence that could elevate their condition, today you will understand the profound psychological and sociological mechanisms that make intelligence inherently intimidating to collective consciousness, and how this understanding can transform your relationship with both your intellectual gifts and your social environment. The phenomenon we will explore today reveals one of the most disturbing truths about human nature and social organization. Intelligence intimidates the masses, not accidentally or temporarily, but systematically and inevitably. This intimidation is not based on misunderstanding or poor communication. It emerges from fundamental conflicts between individual intellectual development and collective psychological needs, between the pursuit of truth and the maintenance of group cohesion, between thinking independently and belonging comfortably to established social structures. If you are prepared to understand why intelligence poses such a fundamental threat to mass psychology, why societies throughout history have developed sophisticated mechanisms for suppressing intellectual independence, and how to use this knowledge to protect your intellectual development while navigating mass social dynamics, leave awakening in the comments below, subscribe to this channel, and activate notifications for analyses that will fundamentally alter your understanding of intelligence, society, and your place within the eternal conflict between individual consciousness and collective conformity. Arthur Schopenhauer understood that what we call the masses is not simply a large number of individual people making independent decisions. The masses represent a distinct form of consciousness, a collective psychological state characterized by shared delusions, mutual reinforcement of comfortable beliefs, and powerful resistance to any information that might threaten group identity or challenge established assumptions. This mass consciousness operates according to psychological principles that are fundamentally different from, and often directly opposed to, the principles that govern individual intellectual development. When we speak of intelligence intimidating the masses, we are not talking about smart people making others feel bad about themselves through arrogant behavior or condescending attitudes. We are discussing a much deeper and more systematic phenomenon, the way that genuine intellectual independence and analytical thinking threaten the psychological foundations upon which mass consciousness depends for its existence and stability. Mass consciousness requires what Schopenhauer called the will's dominance over individual reason. The masses function effectively only when most people most of the time make decisions based on emotion, tradition, social pressure, and unconscious impulses rather than on careful analysis, independent judgment, and rational evaluation of evidence. The person who consistently operates from genuine intelligence represents a fundamental threat to this psychological arrangement because they demonstrate that alternative approaches to thinking and decision-making are possible. Consider how mass movements throughout history have consistently targeted intellectuals and independent thinkers as their primary enemies. This pattern appears in every totalitarian regime, every religious fundamentalist movement, every nationalist uprising, and every ideological revolution. The masses do not target intellectuals because they are politically dangerous or socially subversive, but because intelligence itself represents a form of consciousness that cannot be easily integrated into collective psychological structures. The intelligent person who thinks independently poses a threat to mass consciousness not through what they do or say specifically, but through what they represent existentially. Their very existence demonstrates that people can think for themselves, that popular opinions might be wrong, that traditional beliefs might be unfounded, that group consensus might be based on shared delusions rather than accurate perception of reality. This demonstration is profoundly intimidating to mass consciousness because it suggests that the psychological comfort, social security, and collective identity that the masses derive from shared beliefs and mutual reinforcement might be built on foundations that cannot withstand serious intellectual examination. Rather than confronting this possibility, mass consciousness typically responds by attempting to eliminate or neutralize the source of intellectual challenge. Schopenhauer observed that mass consciousness operates through what we might call psychological contagion, the tendency for emotions, beliefs, and behaviors to spread rapidly through groups without the mediating influence of individual, rational judgment. This contagion creates a form of collective hypnosis in which people lose the capacity for independent thought and become psychologically merged with the group identity. Intelligence is inherently resistant to psychological contagion because it operates from principles of logical analysis, empirical evidence, and independent judgment that are incompatible with the emotional immediacy and social conformity that characterize mass psychological states. The intelligent person who maintains their capacity for independent thought while surrounded by mass consciousness appears to others as someone who is immune to the psychological forces that govern their experience. This immunity is intimidating because it suggests that the psychological states that feel overwhelming and irresistible to mass consciousness are actually optional and can be transcended through intellectual development and conscious choice. If you can think independently while everyone else is caught up in collective emotion, if you can maintain rational judgment while others are swept away by group enthusiasm, if you can see through popular delusions while others are completely convinced by them, then you possess a form of power that mass consciousness cannot understand, control, or replicate. The intimidation that intelligence generates in the masses is therefore not based on intellectual inadequacy or educational deficiency. Many people within mass consciousness are highly educated, professionally successful, and capable of sophisticated thinking within narrow, specialized domains. The intimidation emerges from the recognition that intelligence represents a fundamentally different approach to consciousness itself, an approach that prioritizes individual understanding over group belonging, truth over comfort, authentic perception over social consensus. This recognition threatens the entire psychological and social structure upon which mass consciousness depends. If individual intelligence is superior to collective wisdom, then the masses have been organizing their mental and social lives according to inadequate principles. If independent thinking is more reliable than group consensus, then the democratic and social processes that the masses use to make important decisions are fundamentally flawed. If rational analysis is more effective than emotional reaction and traditional belief, then most people have been living their lives in psychologically and intellectually suboptimal ways. Rather than confronting these uncomfortable implications, mass consciousness typically responds to intelligence with a combination of denial, attack, and systematic suppression. The denial takes the form of claiming that intelligence is irrelevant, impractical, or socially harmful. The attack involves characterizing intelligent individuals as arrogant, antisocial, or out of touch with common human concerns. The suppression operates through social ostracism, economic pressure, and institutional mechanisms designed to marginalize independent thinkers and reward conformity. Schopenhauer recognized that these responses are not random or personally motivated. They represent predictable defensive reactions that emerge whenever mass consciousness encounters genuine intellectual challenge. Understanding these patterns allows intelligent individuals to recognize that the hostility they face is not based on their personal failures or social inadequacies, but on fundamental incompatibilities between individual intellectual development and collective psychological needs. The intimidation factor becomes even more pronounced when we consider how intelligence operates in relation to what Schopenhauer called the world as representation. Most people live entirely within the world of appearances, accepting social constructions of reality as natural laws, cultural conventions as moral truths, and popular opinions as accurate descriptions of objective conditions. They never develop the intellectual independence necessary to distinguish between how things appear and how they actually are. Intelligence that operates at a sophisticated level inevitably penetrates beyond appearances to examine underlying structures, hidden assumptions, and systemic patterns that remain invisible to ordinary consciousness. This penetrating quality of genuine intelligence is deeply intimidating to the masses because it reveals that much of what they consider real, important, and meaningful is actually arbitrary, constructed, and subject to change through conscious choice and collective action. For example, an intelligent analysis of economic systems reveals that many arrangements that people accept as natural and inevitable are actually historical constructions that serve particular interests and could be organized differently. An intelligent examination of political institutions exposes gaps between democratic ideals and actual practices that most people prefer not to acknowledge. An intelligent investigation of cultural beliefs and social norms demonstrates that many things people consider moral, truths or natural laws, are actually conventional agreements that vary across time and place. These revelations are intimidating, not because they are necessarily threatening to individual welfare or social stability, but because they require people to take responsibility for arrangements they prefer to experience as beyond their control. If economic inequality is not natural but constructed, then it could be reduced through conscious social action. If political corruption is not inevitable but systemic, then it could be addressed through institutional reform. If cultural prejudices are not moral truths but inherited biases, then they could be overcome through education and personal development. The masses find these implications intimidating because they suggest that many problems people accept as permanent features of human existence are actually solvable through the application of intelligence, collective will, and sustained effort. This possibility is simultaneously inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring because it offers hope for improvement. Terrifying because it makes people responsible for conditions they have accepted as inevitable. Mass consciousness typically resolves this psychological tension by attacking the intelligence that reveals these possibilities rather than confronting the responsibility that comes with recognizing them. It is psychologically easier to dismiss intelligent analysis as impractical idealism than to examine whether current arrangements actually serve human welfare and could be improved through conscious effort and systematic reform. Schopenhauer also understood that intelligence intimidates the masses because it operates from what he called aesthetic contemplation, the capacity to perceive reality directly without the mediating influence of personal desires, social pressures, or cultural conditioning. This form of consciousness allows intelligent individuals to see situations, people, and social arrangements as they actually are rather than as mass consciousness needs them to be for psychological comfort and social stability. This capacity for objective perception is profoundly intimidating because it means that intelligent individuals cannot be easily manipulated through the emotional appeals, social pressures, and propaganda techniques that are effective with mass consciousness. They evaluate information based on evidence rather than source, judge arguments based on logic rather than popularity, and form opinions based on analysis rather than social consensus. This immunity to mass psychological manipulation represents a form of independence that mass consciousness finds threatening and incomprehensible. If you cannot be convinced to believe something simply because everyone else believes it, if you cannot be pressured to support something simply because it is popular, if you cannot be manipulated through emotional appeals that work on others, then you possess a form of psychological autonomy that challenges the entire basis of mass social control. Throughout history, established authorities have recognized this immunity as their most dangerous enemy. Unlike physical rebellion, which can be suppressed through superior force or economic resistance, which can be overcome through material incentives, intellectual independence operates from internal principles that external pressure can influence but cannot ultimately control. The person who thinks independently, based on rational analysis, cannot be permanently convinced to believe things they know to be false or to support policies they recognize as harmful. They may be silenced, marginalized, or punished, but they cannot be made to genuinely accept ideas that contradict their intellectual understanding, or to abandon analytical methods that they know to be superior to popular alternatives. This recognition helps explain why mass movements consistently target not just specific individuals but intelligence itself as a form of consciousness. The goal is not simply to eliminate particular troublesome thinkers, but to discourage intellectual independence as a general approach to life and to create social conditions in which thinking for oneself becomes psychologically difficult and socially costly. Modern mass media, educational institutions, and cultural industries play crucial roles in this process of intellectual suppression. They don't typically engage in obvious censorship or direct prohibition of independent thought. Instead, they create information environments that make serious intellectual work practically difficult, socially unrewarding, and psychologically exhausting. The constant stream of superficial information, entertainment, and social stimulation that characterizes contemporary culture makes sustained intellectual effort increasingly difficult. The emphasis on immediate results, practical applications, and material success makes the long-term development of understanding seem irrelevant and impractical. The celebration of opinion over analysis, feeling over thinking, and social consensus over individual judgment makes intellectual independence appear antisocial and arrogant. These cultural conditions don't prevent intelligence from developing, but they make it more difficult to develop and more costly to express. The intelligent person who wants to think seriously about important questions must overcome not just intellectual challenges, but social obstacles that make such thinking appear unnecessary, undesirable, or impossible. Understanding these dynamics should give you both realistic expectations about the social reception of your intelligence and confidence in its intrinsic value despite social resistance. The intimidation that your intelligence generates in mass consciousness is not evidence of its inadequacy or social harmfulness. It is evidence of its power and importance, intelligence that poses no challenge to established assumptions, that threatens no comfortable beliefs, that disrupts no existing arrangements, typically has little intellectual value. The fact that your thinking intimidates others may indicate that it is penetrating deeper, revealing more and offering greater potential for understanding and improvement than conventional approaches that leave everyone feeling secure in their existing beliefs and comfortable in their established habits. Schopenhauer counseled intelligent individuals to recognize that this intimidation is both inevitable and potentially beneficial. Inevitable because genuine intelligence necessarily operates according to principles that mass consciousness finds threatening. Potentially beneficial because the discomfort that intelligence creates in others may encourage some individuals to develop their own intellectual capabilities and may contribute to gradual improvements. in collective reasoning abilities over time. The key is learning to navigate mass social dynamics without compromising your intellectual integrity or abandoning your commitment to independent thinking. This requires developing what we might call strategic intelligence, the ability to recognize when and how to express your insights in ways that minimize defensive reactions while maintaining analytical honesty and intellectual authenticity. Sometimes this means communicating complex ideas gradually rather than all at once, focusing on specific applications rather than general principles, asking questions that lead others to discoveries rather than stating conclusions directly. These communication strategies don't represent intellectual compromise. They recognize the psychological realities of how mass consciousness processes challenging information and adapt your approach to maximize the likelihood that important insights will be heard and considered rather than immediately dismissed or attacked. You should also understand that the goal is not to eliminate the intimidation that your intelligence creates, but to use it wisely for constructive purposes. Some degree of intellectual challenge is necessary for individual development and social progress. Ideas that never make anyone uncomfortable probably aren't revealing anything important or suggesting anything that needs to be changed. The intimidation that intelligence generates can serve positive functions if it encourages people to examine their assumptions more carefully, to develop their thinking abilities more fully, or to consider possibilities they had not previously imagined. The key is ensuring that this intellectual challenge serves educational rather than merely disruptive purposes and contributes to genuine understanding rather than just social conflict. Historical analysis reveals that societies benefit enormously from individuals who maintain intellectual independence despite social pressure and continue to develop their analytical abilities despite mass resistance. The scientific revolution, the development of democratic institutions, the expansion of human rights, and virtually every other form of genuine social progress emerged from minds that refused to accept conventional limitations on thinking and analysis. These contributions typically required individuals who were willing to be intimidating to mass consciousness, who insisted on thinking independently despite social pressure, who pursued truth despite its social costs. Without such intellectual courage, human knowledge would stagnate at the level of popular opinion and traditional belief, and social arrangements would never improve beyond what mass consciousness finds comfortable and familiar. In the comments below, describe a situation where you felt your intelligence intimidated others and how you plan to use this understanding to contribute more effectively to important conversations and social progress. Let's build a community of individuals who understand that the intimidation intelligence creates in mass consciousness is often evidence of its necessity and potential value. Remember Arthur Schopenhauer's profound observation: a man can do what he ought to do, but he cannot will what he ought to will. The masses are intimidated by your intelligence because they recognize, however unconsciously, that it represents capabilities they could develop if they chose to do so. But they cannot will themselves to make the intellectual effort that such development requires. This intimidation is therefore not really about you or your intellectual abilities. It's about their recognition of their own unrealized potential and their unwillingness to invest the time, energy, and psychological discomfort necessary to develop that potential. Your intelligence confronts them with possibilities they have abandoned and reminds them of choices they continue to avoid. Don't minimize your intellectual capabilities to make mass consciousness more comfortable. The world needs people who are willing to think independently despite social pressure, to maintain analytical standards despite popular resistance, to pursue understanding despite the intimidation it creates in others. Your intelligence is intimidating precisely because it works, because it reveals truth, because it offers possibilities for improvement that mass consciousness finds both attractive and threatening. This intimidation is the price of intellectual honesty in a world that often prefers comfortable delusions to difficult truths. Pay this price willingly, knowing that your intellectual independence contributes to humanity's gradual movement toward greater understanding, wisdom, and authentic progress. The intimidation you create today may contribute to the intellectual courage that others develop tomorrow. The example you set by thinking independently may inspire future generations to value intelligence over conformity, understanding over comfort, truth over social acceptance. Society has always been intimidated by intelligence, and it probably always will be. Your choice is not whether to eliminate this intimidation, but whether to honor your intellectual nature despite it, or to sacrifice your thinking abilities for social comfort that may not be worth having if it requires intellectual dishonesty. Choose courage. Choose authenticity. Choose the development of your intellectual capabilities despite the intimidation it creates in mass consciousness. The world desperately needs more people willing to think clearly, analyze honestly, and speak truthfully about what they discover, even when their insights intimidate those who prefer comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable enlightenment.